In the heat of trade negotiations, the unexpected is often the rule rather than the exception. And when US President Donald Trump announced a 50% tariff on copper pipes, wiring, and related products, it was designed to send shockwaves through both the American and Canadian markets. The tariff, which was set to take effect the following day, came with the bold claim that it was necessary for national security. On the surface, this move seemed like a significant escalation in the ongoing trade battle between the US and Canada. But as the hours ticked down to the deadline, Canada's response was not one of panic or retaliation. It was a well-calculated exercise in patience and strategy. Mark Carney, then Governor of the Bank of Canada, was a key figure in this drama, guiding Canada's response. When news of the tariff broke, Canadian officials didn't scramble for emergency press conferences or convene midnight cabinet meetings. Instead, Carney and his team remained calm and collected, having already anticipated such an eventuality. They understood that while Trump's move could be disruptive, it wasn't as damaging as it first appeared. Canada's copper industry, which primarily exports semi-processed items like cathodes, anodes, and concentrates, was largely insulated from the tariff's impact. The tariff targeted products that Canada did not heavily produce, such as copper rods, tubes, and pipes, leaving their most valuable exports untouched. This moment marked a crucial juncture in the ongoing trade dispute. Trump, known for his brash and unpredictable decision-making, had hoped to force Canada into a hasty concession, but the approach backfired. The US president, desperate to appear strong in front of his base, was using the tariff as a bargaining chip to push Canada into a corner. But instead of crumbling under the pressure, Canada stood firm. The situation exposed a flaw in Trump's strategy. While he sought to make a decisive move, he was dealing with a partner who had already adapted to the shifting landscape. From Ottawa's perspective, the US tariffs weren't a game-changer. Carney had already calculated the potential impact, knowing that Canada's trade structure had been evolving over the past several years. By diversifying its exports and reducing its reliance on the US market, Canada had positioned itself to withstand tariff pressures more effectively than many other countries in similar situations. Rather than frantically negotiating to avert catastrophe, Carney's team had quietly set the stage for a long-term strategy of economic resilience. Meanwhile, Trump's actions were seen as part of a broader pattern, unpredictable, volatile, and focused on creating chaos rather than negotiating in good faith. As Canadian officials observed the unfolding events, it became clear that Trump wasn't engaged in a traditional negotiation. His moves weren't designed to secure a mutually beneficial deal, they were about control, forcing his counterpart into a reactive position. But Carney was playing a different game. He understood that in international diplomacy, patience and strategic calm often proved more valuable than hasty reactions. At the same time, provincial leaders like Ontario Premier Doug Ford expressed frustration with Trump's erratic behavior. Ford's comment that the cheese slips off the cracker perfectly captured the sense of unpredictability that Canadian officials were grappling with. For many, it raised a fundamental question. How could Canada formulate a long-term industrial strategy when its most important trade partner could change course overnight based on whims and headlines? Ford's frustration was not just about the specific tariff or trade war, it reflected a deeper concern about the broader stability of US leadership and how to manage Canada's future economic relationship with a president who didn't seem to follow any logical playbook. However, the Canadian approach, led by Carney, was not about reacting to every unpredictable move from Washington. Instead, it was about creating space to maneuver and buying time. While the US had set a deadline, Carney's refusal to bow to that timeline was a deliberate choice. He understood that the hard deadline Trump had imposed was largely a tactic, one designed to create a sense of urgency and pressure. But Canada, in this case, wasn't vulnerable to such deadlines. It had already secured over 80% of its trade agreements under the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, and other multilateral deals, meaning that any sudden moves by the US would have a limited impact. For Canada, the situation was far from a crisis. The country was not facing the same level of economic vulnerability that Trump's administration had hoped to exploit. In fact, Canada was already working to diversify its markets and deepen its economic ties with other countries, especially in Europe and Asia. Carney's team understood that the real challenge wasn't simply getting a deal with Trump, it was ensuring that Canada's long-term economic trajectory wasn't defined by US whims, and unpredictable shifts in policy. As the clock ticked toward Trump's self-imposed August 1st deadline, Carney's quiet diplomacy was proving effective. Instead of hastily reacting to Trump's bluster, Carney remained focused on the bigger picture, positioning Canada for success regardless of what happened next. He understood that trade negotiations were not just about short-term wins, but about shaping a future where Canada had the freedom to negotiate on its own terms. While Trump's administration was fumbling through its own internal confusion, often sending contradictory signals about the tariff deadlines and their actual meaning, Carney's calm steadiness was becoming more apparent. The narrative that the US had created a hard deadline and was applying intense pressure on Canada had begun to unravel. The tariff announcement, while sensationalized by US media, didn't have the devastating impact that many had feared. It was a blow to US copper industries as well, making it clear that tariffs weren't just about punishing foreign competitors, they were also about disrupting the US economy. In Ottawa, Carney's response was one of measured inaction. Canada didn't need to react in real time to every erratic move from Washington. Instead, the country could afford to wait and observe, knowing that time itself was a crucial asset. The longer the US pushed for a deal under conditions that weren't favorable to Canada, the more the imbalance would become apparent. Trump, whose strategy relied on destabilizing tactics and creating chaos, was being outmaneuvered by Carney's calm, methodical approach. By maintaining composure, Carney demonstrated a powerful truth. In trade, sometimes the most effective strategy is not to play the other side's game. As the US scrambled to create leverage, Canada quietly strengthened its own position, waiting for the moment when it could negotiate from a place of strength, not desperation. As the days passed after Trump's tariff announcement, it became increasingly evident that the situation was far from the crisis US officials had anticipated. Mark Carney's measured response to the US threats highlighted the stark difference between the two countries' approaches to trade and diplomacy. The timing of Trump's tariff announcement couldn't have been more deliberate, aimed at forcing a deal on his terms before the critical August 1st deadline. Yet, Carney wasn't fazed by the arbitrary deadlines or the rhetoric emanating from Washington. His team had already assessed the situation months in advance, understanding not only the impact of these tariffs, but also the nuances of Canada's evolving trade landscape. This shift away from reliance on the US had been happening for years, and Trump's tariffs merely served as a catalyst for further diversification, rather than a disruptive blow. The final twist in this chapter of the trade war would come not from a new tariff or deadline, but from the realization that Trump's aggressive tactics were losing their potency. As the confusion in Washington reached new heights, Carney's quiet resistance began to look like the smarter strategy. Trump's approach was erratic, and Carney's calm was becoming increasingly powerful. Canada wasn't just resisting the US, it was quietly redefining its future. And in that moment, Canada's future no longer depended on the clock that Trump had tried to impose. It depended on the clock